an Excelsior Studios original production. Throughout this podcast, sensitive subjects such as sexual assault, eating disorders, and suicidal thoughts will be mentioned. Listen with care. And throughout this podcast, sometimes I will use AI to bring real social media posts and messages to life. While the voices you are hearing are fake, the words that they are reading are 100% real. And I will be sure to point them out to you throughout the episode so you don't get confused. Really quick, it's important to note, and we didn't get enough clarification on this last time, so if anyone is here from iTown or can speak to this, I really want to know. She was convincing some ARC pastors that there was a murder for hire plot.
We really need to
So, really crazy stuff.
Yes, we need to revisit the murder for hires because we did not touch on that.
We didn't talk enough about that.
We're not talking enough about the murder for hires.
That's a clip of me and Justin from a Twitter space we held discussing the Megan saga a few days after her arrest. We had known about the rental scam accusation and the social media posts, but we were just getting to know the other players she had been scamming for years. In Chloe's Twitter thread, she mentioned that Megan had some involvement with a community of pastors with some affiliation to ARC churches or the Association of Related Churches, an evangelical network of churches throughout Northern America. One of the most puzzling stories we heard, and we clearly wanted to get to the bottom of, was an accusation against Megan where pastors claimed in messages they publicly tweeted and statements they put out to their congregations that Megan had convinced them of a murder for hire plot out against them in May of 2022. Okay, so let's back up. Murder for hire? Insanity, I know. I had never heard of something like this before, and this is not even the craziest story that we will get into today. But first, an observation about this plot that is almost more shocking. Megan didn't do this for money. Up to this point, people thought Megan was a social media weirdo who had run a low-level white-collar crime and been caught. What we learned as we looked deeper into the story is that Megan ran a multitude of scams, many of which had nothing to do with trying to take money from people. She took their time, their judgment, and in some cases, their sanity. And for what? What does a woman get from convincing people she's never met before that there are people out there trying to come to their homes and kill them? On its surface, it's so absurd it's funny. But when you look more closely at it, this becomes much more sinister. Who has the time to create these elaborate stories and schemes with people they've never met before? Why would someone ever put someone through that? It's one thing to steal a loaf of bread to feed your family. It's another to create an elaborate plot based on lies to get them to talk to you. But as we began to learn, that is Megan's MO, or one of her MOs. So in today's episode, we're going to look at a lot of the schemes Megan ran in various communities throughout the years that were not for financial gain. I'm Amanda, and this is Don't Waste This Effing Podcast, the story of Megan Stoner. Don't Waste This Podcast is a completely independent podcast. It was written, recorded, produced, and edited by me, Amanda. Please be sure to like and subscribe to this channel if you're listening on YouTube. Rate me 5 stars if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And be sure to share with a friend if you think that they would like to hear this story. Because this is independent, you won't be bombarded by intrusive advertisements or sponsorships throughout the show. You're welcome. If you'd like to learn how to make your very own podcast like this one, I've put together a course that teaches you how to do everything step by step, and you can find the link to that in the description. If you'd like to hear more from me, maybe get your head checked, but you can check out my daily news updates podcast about U.S. politics and national security, foreign policy, the Middle East conflict. That will be linked in the description as well.
I've spent a lot of time, having gone to an all-girls school, being in a sorority, I've spent a lot of time with women, not to down talk us women, but it is pretty obvious when someone is searching for attention.
This is Kate, a former acquaintance of Megan's. Well, not really acquaintance. Megan likely friended Kate on social media back in the day, as she was a part of College Republicans while Megan was active as well. She doesn't remember accepting Megan's request. However,
I had looked her up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so I didn't necessarily know who she was, but I was blocked on everything. So she knew enough to block me, but then, or at least somehow knew who I was and that I couldn't be trusted, or she didn't want me seeing everything she posts. Then I also knew that she had these public accounts. So I always thought I could make a burner account and kind of keep track of her, but I knew that it seemed like that's what she wanted. Like, why would you block thousands of people and then have a public account? You obviously still want strangers seeing what you have to say or what's so tragic going on in your life, wanting sympathy, definitely wanting attention.
so as she points out there, it was pretty obvious to everyone, especially women, that Megan did a lot of this stuff she did online purely for attention. As Kate pointed out, if she didn't want sympathy from people, she would have just had a private profile and only accepted requests from people that she knew. But Megan did the opposite. She would friend everyone she could find on social media, anyone she had a mutual friend with, and then preemptively block people that she thought might cause issues for her. But why do this? Well, as you learned in the previous episode, unfortunately, Megan didn't have a ton of friends. She didn't seem to have a job, but it seemed like she craved some sort of human interaction, which is understandable. And one of the ways she got that was through social media. When she was able to get people to talk to her, our theory is that she would sometimes make up these elaborate stories to keep people hooked and talking to her. Sometimes she got into these circles by presenting herself as an authority in some way, which is how she got in with the Ark Church people. Megan started a podcast called the Sinking Ark Podcast in December of 2021, just around the time she was running the rental scam. In her first episode, she describes what she intended for the podcast to be about.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan, and I am your host for the Sinking Ark podcast. I am not here to bash anyone that attends iTown or that loves iTown or that has attended in the past. I am here to help the victims of iTown and Ark churches all over the U.S. and even internationally tell their stories. In the coming podcast, you will hear stories of broken people and broken situations. And you will also hear about how even in the midst of all of this, God has still moved in these very broken situations. In this podcast, these stories will not be about myself or my co-host, Isaiah.
However, in typical Megan fashion, she did make the podcast about herself. We're getting a little off topic here, but this is too good to leave out. In a complete reversal from episode 1, here is a clip from the second episode.
Hi, everyone. This is your host, Megan Stoner. This episode is coming to you delayed, and after this is posted, it will be after the holiday, so I hope everyone had a great Christmas and potentially a great start to the new year. I don't know when exactly I'll be able to release this next clip. Unfortunately, during the past week of my life, I've experienced the worst cyberbullying I've ever experienced in my entire life. Countless accusations have been made about me and my family. Countless things have been said about me. I've had people that I don't even know stick up for me on social media, and for that, I will be forever grateful. I've had people approach me in random places to offer support or to hear my side of the story, and all I can say is allegations about me and anything are false. But what is true is that I started a podcast that you're listening to right now to get to the bottom of the truth from Ark and iTown Church specifically. As soon as I've released the trailer, and as soon as before the trailer even came out, I was being attacked viciously on social media. And I just wanted to say that it's not been fun. It's not been fair. My family has been deeply hurt in so many different ways. that I hope to go into in future episodes. However, I'm very limited on what I'm able to say per my attorney and legal counsel at the moment. All I will say is that I have withstood the storm that this has brought into my life, and I withstood the attacks on my character. I withstood the defamation on my character, and I'm still who I am, and I know that I have done nothing wrong. I have just wanted to get the truth out here about iTown and all the terrible things they've done in our community and ARC as an organization. I truly appreciate everyone that's taking time to listen. I also want to let you know that this happened during a very, very, very hard time for my family, and my dad was in the hospital. And at this time of the recording, he still is. And it's been a very bad, very hard time for my family. And the fact that we've continued having attacks, I've had people show up randomly at my home, knocking on my door. And by the time you listen to this, and the reason why it's delayed is because I've had to move. And I obviously will not be releasing my new location on this podcast or anywhere publicly for a very, very, very long time, if ever. I will just say that having to move after I had just moved into this new house that I was living at, I had only lived here for almost a month and a half. And I've had to move because of stalking, harassment that has not stopped. I've made countless police reports during all of this, and unfortunately, not a lot of justice has been done. I plan to continue to pursue the fight for peace and truth in all of this. I want peace within my family, and I want the attacks to stop. And if you're someone that has attacked my character, I ask you this: why haven't you come to me directly and asked me about these allegations? Why haven't you taken the time to get to know my story and to get to know what has really happened? Because what has really happened is all that I wanted to do was talk about what this church had done. I wanted to talk about the things I had found. And for an entire week, iTown got me distracted, and that's my fault. I was distracted. I was taking care of my family, myself, trying to find a new place to live, getting movers, things like that. But you know what? I am still here, and I still plan to expose the truth to all that will listen, and I will scream it from the rooftops. I will not be silent. I will not go away. I hope you will continue tuning in to The Sinking Ark. This is your host. Until next time, everyone. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I had to put this in. It's classic Megan. She says this is about exposing scandals, but then she makes it about herself. It's very over the top and dramatic. Interestingly, she intertwines the actual drama going on in her life. I believe this is around the time she was evicted from her house due to non-payment with this fake scandal she's created. She blames the podcast for why she had to suddenly move. If you remember from the second episode, this Facebook post, this was from around the time as well.
So I've stayed pretty silent in hopes that things would fade away, but I'm sitting here making funeral plans for both of my parents. My mom was shot at last night as a result of drama on social media. My dad's blood pressure is 60/50 at the moment, and we have no idea what the next moment holds. Melanie, you just lost your mom, but yet have bullied me on here. And if you can tell people to stop coming to my door as I'm trying to meet with a minister to go over funeral plans, that would be great.
So that's the AI voice of Megan, again, reading her probably most infamous social media post. Again, she really knocks it out of the park with that one. She finds a way to check all of the boxes. She yells at her online brigade of haters at the same time she promotes her new podcast. She gives herself an excuse to talk about drama in her life, which would potentially garner sympathy from people. I want to point out again in that Facebook post, she claims both of her parents are dead and kind of changes her mind in the middle. In the podcast, she says her father was in the hospital and makes no mention of her mom being in poor health. She also does not mention a shooting. But by claiming that she's had this big dramatic life event because she started this podcast to expose iTown and ARC churches, she was able to get close to a group of actual influential leaders throughout the church hurt movement and establish herself as an authority. And this is the group of people she would go on to scam with the fake murder for hire plot. While none of the pastors or influential leaders in this community would give comment to the podcast, here's what we know. The church herd community discusses wrongdoings done by churches. In this case, they seem to really focus on ARC churches, and the Indiana affiliate of ARC churches, I believe, is iTown. These wrongdoings can be anything from doctrinal differences to sexual assault scandals. Chloe believes Megan found her way into this community through Reddit, where she found Julie Royce, a prominent leader in the movement who spoke frequently about sexual assault survivors. Megan presented herself as a survivor on Reddit and began speaking with Julie. I believe Megan was a guest on Julie's podcast, and the two seemed to tweet at each other somewhat frequently. From Megan's relationship with Julie, she was able to make connections with other leaders in the movement, including Pastor Jeff Thompson, who has a church in Vancouver, Canada. It seems that at a certain point around March of 2022, Megan began exhibiting patterns of behavior we have discussed at length on this podcast with Julie Royce. It seems Julie cut Megan off, but didn't tell the rest of the church herd community about her weird experience with Megan. And because of that, Megan continued to speak to the other people in the community. Notably, there seems to be some drama within that community surrounding Julie and a book she wrote in 2017 called Redeeming the Feminine Soul, where, based on blog posts written by other community members, they seem to feel she had like an inappropriate relationship with a younger female member of the church when she was that congregation goer's youth pastor, which she wrote about in that book. So it seems members of the community already had issues with Julie, and that could be the reason that she didn't come forward about her problems with Megan right away. However, because Julie didn't warn the community about Megan, Megan was able to continue talking to a lot of those pastors and scam them as well, including Pastor Jeff Thompson from the church up in Canada. So this all came to a head when Megan convinced Pastor Thompson that there was a murder for hire plot out on him and his family, as well as on Julie Royce. Julie tweeted about this on May 4th of 2022.
I got pulled into Megan's bizarre world several weeks ago when Pastor Jeff Thompson called to warn me about an alleged hit that had been put out on me and him. The next day, he called to apologize, saying he had been duped by a Megan Stoner IN, who had created an elaborate hoax.
And as with every time you hear somebody reading something, that was the AI voice of Julie Royce reading that tweet. But from what I understand, Pastor Thompson and some other pastors in this movement and Julie all have these disagreements. I'm honestly not sure what they're about, but Megan exploited this, co-opting the language they use with one another that I guess she would have picked up through the Reddit and convinced them of this elaborate lie that she completely made up. Pastor Thompson released this statement to his congregation about it.
Out of love for the church, and because she has repeatedly attempted to insert herself into the victim community, I feel the need to make a public statement regarding the credibility of Megan Stoner. I interacted with Megan over the course of several weeks and appeared on the second episode of her podcast after meeting her on the All About Coath Seath subreddit. Our interaction rapidly devolved into a bizarre situation in which Megan attempted to impersonate multiple pastors from the ARC and the governor of Indiana. Yes, really. She created multiple fake phone numbers to text from, forged multiple phone screenshots, attempted to impersonate the governor of Indiana on a Skype call, and created entirely fictional narratives with no basis in reality. While I cannot speak to Megan's mental health, I can attest to her desperate desire for attention and her willingness to prey on vulnerable persons, including victims of abuse, in order to satiate.
And that's an AI voice reading the statement he put out on May 2nd of 2022. He doesn't say in this statement, but from what I can gather from my digging online, Megan convinced them that some people were willing to go to extreme lengths to stop people like Julie and Pastor Thompson from exposing things that they knew were going on in church circles. What those things were, I cannot tell you. Part of me wonders if Megan did all of this because Julie had cut her off and Megan was trying to get Julie to speak to her again, but I'm really not sure. I wish some of these pastors had gotten back to me for this story, but I also understand why they wouldn't want to relive and relitigate this. And I want to defend them on that too, because I know that this all sounds insane, and it is, but from what I understand, these people knew something was off about Megan, but they had never met her in person. She seemed to know other people in the community, so she seemed to have been vetted, and I believe she actually introduced Pastor Thompson and Royce through her podcast. So these guys knew something was off about Megan, but at a certain point, when they were in super deep, if you're inundated with texts from strange numbers saying threatening things and claiming authority, I can understand why they may have paused and taken some of those threats seriously for a moment. However, they figured out that it had been Megan that had been sending these texts, and at that point, they all cut her off. People in the community began putting out statements to their congregations and online communities, warning people not to talk to Megan because of what she had done. Julie ended up having to step down from a big conference she was holding for victims of sexual assault called the Restore Conference, and they uninvited Megan from that conference. Interestingly, if you remember the story from Megan's former acquaintance in the previous episode, where Megan invited her to attend a conference with her at the last minute and then told her she needed to leave and find her own way home, I believe that is the conference that Megan was referring to. And I think Megan showed up anyways with this friend, trying to get in with this crowd again, but either got scared and changed her mind or was exposed in some way. However, I can't confirm this for sure. So, a lot to unpack here, I know, but notice the consistencies between this insane story and the others that we've heard. As Pastor Thompson said, Megan wanted attention and she was willing to do anything, even crazy things, to get it. She came into the community hard and fast. Others assumed that she had been vetted by other community members. She got adversarial when she was kicked out of the group. Here's a tweet read by the AI voice of Megan from April 26, 2022, where she basically calls Julie an abuser.
Some may say I'm bitter. Some may say I'm immature. But I've seen Julie Roy's behavior in private. It is beyond disturbing. I stood on conscience and was uninvited to her conference next month. Meanwhile, she's making a profit off of abuse victims. Hashtag enough said.
All classic Megan attributes. And for what reason other than attention? She never asked these people for money. She wasn't applying for jobs in this community. The podcast that she started is not monetized. It never hit the podcast charts. Really, I've racked my brain. I cannot figure out why she did this for any reason other than for gaining attention. And like I said, this is really funny, but it's also really sick. This is a community of pastors who help people who claim to have been hurt in churches to get over mental health, abuse, and sexual trauma. Megan stole their time from them and went to the lengths of starting an entire podcast to get them to talk to her. All the while, they could have spent all that time helping actual victims. That is, victims who wouldn't turn around and create an elaborate hoax to get them to continue speaking to them. And again, this is all for attention. She did a ton of things purely for attention.
She would post the most intimate details and also like graphic pictures. I mean, she would post, she couldn't bruise herself without posting it somewhere online. And then also post some of these really incredibly graphic, scary looking injuries that she would get. And no normal person would post that. Like, you don't post every time you get a paper cut or bruise yourself, but she would. And then also to post like gaping wounds in her body. It's just she clearly wanted the attention and she wanted sympathy.
I don't know if you've ever seen the meme of the girl who always had a cast on in elementary or middle school because she wanted attention. Like, the person from growing up who always had crutches or a sling or needed a Band-Aid for some new ailment, said that they were in the hospital over the weekend, like just like generally kind of a low-level hypochondriac. Megan's social media is kind of the adult online version of that meme. Obviously, people get injured and we should feel sympathy for them, but when it happens over and over and over again, to the point it almost becomes their personality trait, that's the line that Megan just crossed. If you scroll through her Facebook or Twitter, you will see a ton of really graphic, disturbing photos of herself, stripped down to almost like being naked sometimes, showing really intense bruises. Like the Facebook post from around the time she started her podcast.
I mean, it's just weird. It's like, I don't need to see that. Go send that picture to your doctor. Don't post it for the Twitter doctors, or I don't know. Why do you need attention for that? Just go home and heal. Don't put it online for everyone to see. And it is weird. It is grotesque. It is graphic, the stuff that she posts. It's unnecessary. It's like uncomfortable.
Sometimes these injuries or terrible life events really did happen. And she would seamlessly intertwine reality with the fake story she was creating to bring more people in to her circus or keep them talking to her.
My thigh is incredibly swollen, and the pressure on the issues hurts like nothing in this world. I'm trying to believe there's a possibility of this being solved without it being surgery.
This is the AI voice of Megan reading a post from around a time she claimed to have been in a car crash with one of the infamous Teslas. A few days later, she posted about another injury, and the swollen thigh and bruise had magically healed. This happened a lot.
I do remember just a few months before she was arrested, she went through a 3 or 4 day period where she was talking about having an eating disorder. And she was posting about like, I finally, was able to eat a meal today, and I just allowed myself to sit and enjoy this. And I actually think it was a piece of cake, ironically. And she was like, I just finally allowed myself to eat a piece of cake and enjoy the cake and not worry about the guilt and shame. And I remember thinking like, okay, you were in the hospital for something else last week, and now it's transitioned to a complete eating disorder. And then another one of her more bizarre posts in the few months before her arrest, which she was arrested in May, I would say around like the beginning of last year. It was like those last 5 months, it got really out of hand. But she had posted that she had been in a psychiatric facility, and she posted her arm wrapped up as though she'd been self-harming. And then she crashed her Tesla like 2 or 3 days later, and she posted pictures of her injuries. And her arm was in that picture, and there were no like scars or any sign of self-injury. And lots of things like that were happening around that time.
That's Justin talking about how she would post frequently about the injuries. and kind of changing them. She'd be in and out of the hospital a lot, she claimed. It was intense. It was a wild ride on her social media.
It was never just, oh, I got into a car accident. It was, well, I had miscarried for the 17th time, and then my boyfriend was on the East Coast at the White House running this event, and I crashed my Tesla into like Mike Pence's motorcade because I was driving in the motorcade, and then some terrorist was trying to kill him and shot me instead. And then my mom and my dad died, unrelated.
So that was not a real story that Megan's told about herself. That was never a full-fledged social media post. That never happened. However, if I put that in Megan's AI voice, it probably wouldn't sound far off from the rest of her posts, right? I mean, it was that dramatic and over the top, and it was all the time. And to use political language here, there was never a call to action on any of these posts. It was never, I've been in this terrible car crash, please donate to my GoFundMe. It was never, oh, I'm having this hard time, please help me with my medical bills. She didn't post stuff like this. Again, this is the time she's pretending to be like a high-powered political consultant, but she would post these really, again, like over-the-top, grotesque, graphic photographs of herself with these injuries, and like really for no reason that's discernible other than attention. She wasn't trying to make money outwardly. It looks like she just wanted sympathy and wanted attention. And again, like just in the most dramatic way possible. And she did this a lot. And I kind of wonder how the doctors in the local hospitals felt about her. Like, did they know she was coming in and like, oh, here she is again? Because, she would post being there. So we know some of these things were real. She would post photos of herself being in the hospital. She would post herself with the hospital bracelet. So we knew she was there. We knew she was doing something. But, what did the hospital people think about her? Because then there's the kind of the conversation that we'll kind of end the episode with, which is when people seem to have these sort of mental kind of problems that a lot of people have picked up on Megan having, the pastors from the beginning of the episode, people just looking at her social media, people who have that sort of mental issue, it can be hard to treat them because they can tend to exploit the people that are treating them. So you saw with the pastors, these are people who open their hearts and their arms to people who are suffering abuse, and they sit with them and they help them work through it with the word of the Lord, and preach the gospel. And I don't care what you think about religion, most churches are meant to be open to that. When people come broken, they are meant to accept them. And these pastors, I can tell you, they are that. They did welcome her with open arms. I promise. I spoke to some of them off the record. Like they really did try with her. And Megan tells them that there's a fake murder for hire plot. And we know she did this with other medical providers too.
So this is one of the most bizarre stories I've ever heard about Megan Stoner, and I'll say right at the beginning, I was not directly involved, but I do know that it did happen more or less exactly the way I'm going to say it because I've heard it from a couple different people. But Megan, in the beginning of 2020, sought counseling through a therapist who was online, remote. I believe Megan told me at one point she had a therapist in New York State, so I presume it's the same person.
And she told the therapist that she was dealing with a lot of stress from her job, which working in the governor's office, COVID's hitting, that makes a lot of sense to the therapist. However, we know as much as we looked at Megan, like at this point by 2020, she was completely blackballed from the state house, not have even like been in the room with the governor or his staff, like completely far-fetched that she would have ever worked there. So again, like no part of Megan's story is true. But the therapist doesn't know this, doesn't even live in the state, only knows what Megan has told her. And Megan says, for the first few sessions, it's, just talking about normal job stress and how that related to the pandemic. But, kind of true to form with Megan, she kind of gets bored of that as a while. So she has to make it more dramatic. She has to increase what's actually going on. So then she tells the therapist that part of her job was to deal with the dead bodies of the people in the governor's office who had taken their own lives. As though that was such an epidemic that it was happening every day. I mean, I chuckle as I say it, but it is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in my life. That somebody would claim to a virtual therapist that they worked in the governor's office and that they were dealing with cleaning up dead bodies inside the governor's staff, that it was such a problem. It's so far-fetched out of reality.
All right, and this is another one of those stories that, again, I don't believe this has ever been talked about publicly. This was never said on a Twitter space. I've always heard rumblings about this happening. I've heard this story from multiple people. Justin has heard this story from multiple people. So this happened, but this has been kept under wraps for whatever reason. And for whatever reason being that, as much as I kind of want to laugh because it's so absurd, it's also really disturbing. Again, who does something like this? And who does something like this? I am sorry to anybody who's mad about this going in, but again, how do you tell the story of Megan Stoner? She's not just a prolific Facebook poster. I could have filled this episode with a million AI voices of her, telling these crazy stories, but at a certain point, yeah, there's a lot of people who post weird things on Facebook. I don't think there's a lot of people in the United States who go to therapists and come up with this big, elaborate lie. And it gets worse.
Megan then tells the therapist, as she's telling these stories, she's using names along the way that are easy to look up, easy to verify that, these are, the actual people who do work for the governor. And so if the therapist was, even remotely believed any of this was true and started to look things up, she would have found Megan did know all the right names of the people who worked in the governor's office. Megan tells the therapist, that she's, experiencing all this abuse at work, telling her all these names of big, high-level senior staff for the governor. And the therapist eventually did report it somewhere. There ended up being an Indiana State Police investigation into this. And very senior staffers for the governor were questioned. It was in a situation, it got to a point because of this that very high up people nearly lost their jobs. And I don't know exactly how, somewhere along the line, someone says the name Megan Stoner. And everyone in the room immediately, as it was told to me, goes, oh. And immediately they were able to piece together that this was all Megan making things up again that were not true.
So in a previous episode, we talked about how Megan would repeatedly send these resumes in with fake names on them, hoping to get hired. And I guess I don't know what happens if she gets hired under a fake name with a fake phone number, because she knows they won't hire her under her name. So what does she do when she shows up and it's her? And then I guess at a certain point with this story, she just kind of bypassed that whole thing and she just faked it anyways and went to therapy for it. And, again, not only is this just bizarre, but what do you do if you're a therapist in this situation? I mean, Megan presumably went to therapy to get help through a job that she didn't have, about a situation that wasn't happening. Again, I'm trying not to laugh because it's like, that's kind of so absurd. It's funny, but it's also really disturbing. And as we move forward throughout this, again, when we talk about, Megan ran a rental scam and scammed between, it was thought between 20 and 50 people out of one rental home. And we'll get into that into the next episode. But this goes so much further than like a financial crime. And again, like, this is something that Megan was never charged with, to my knowledge. Maybe there's an investigation. I don't know. But how do you charge someone again with like lies? This probably spills into some sort of territory where it's so egregious. But again, like, a complete waste of resources that she seemingly only did because she wanted the therapist to pay attention to her. Kind of sad, kind of funny, absurd. But what do you do? How do you send somebody like this to therapy? Because how do you know that they're telling the truth? How do you know that they're getting help for a condition that they really have? Again, this isn't just a financial crime where she's stealing a loaf of bread to feed her family. This isn't someone who just, if she had a steady job, if she was able to hold a steady job, she could pay her bills and she wouldn't have to scam rental homes. This is somebody who has some sort of propensity to lie to a level that I've never heard of with anybody else before. And don't worry, it gets more disturbing. It gets worse.
At some point in the story, Megan then got very sexual with her messages with this therapist. At one point, she tried to claim that she was the governor and that the governor was messaging the therapist and tried to pretend to be him. These are all behaviors that we saw, and it all went back into her playbook of, overtly sexual, claiming to be an elected official, claiming to work for elected officials that she didn't even really have any access to at this point. It's the same themes that kept coming up over and over again.
And there's a preview of what we'll get into in the coming episodes. Again, with all of these, we noticed similar patterns. She comes on strong. At a point, she becomes overbearing. She'll get adversarial. In this instance, I've not heard if she's been questioned. So I don't know if she would be adversarial in this scenario. But all in all, I mean, she created a really big mess for people around her. And the most insane and brazen thing about it is that she stood to gain nothing from it. Besides, again, getting attention. She didn't make any money from this. She wasn't trying to make any money from this. And again, like, if Megan was just a prolific Facebook poster who kind of got a low-level white-collar crime, this would all blow over. Nobody would care. It's instances like this. It's instances where she is so good at perpetuating the lie that she can wrap people up in this. She's got, you know, a therapist who probably knows it's all bullshit, but at a certain point, it's so crazy. You gotta report it, I guess, must have been his thinking, which spurs a whole investigation because it's so insane, you know? And finally, they find out, oh, it's just this girl. From what I understand, again, and Megan's smart. Like, during COVID, the person that I think she claimed to be would have been visible on camera. So Megan could just easily use that person's name. And I guess it must have worked. Clearly. Because there's something to this. And again, this is a woman who clearly knows no bounds, clearly isn't concerned about the state of India. I mean, for somebody who claims to care so much about politics and care so much about but typically young people who care about politics, when they get involved, they want to see change happen. They want to make something of themselves, but also make their state better, make their county better, make the country better. And I've never seen her make a political statement besides the piece of legislation that she had sponsored that did not pass, which was to make it legal for people under 18 to run for office, which is the legislation she pushed through when she volunteered in the House. And then when she eventually was, either left the House or was chased out, we'll get to why I think she was kind of chased out of working at the Indiana Capitol when she was in high school in coming episodes. But then she just moves on to the campaign cycle. And then when she's kicked out of that, she just goes around pretending that she does it. I hope you can see why this story has been followed by so many people. Why people feel that she's so egregious, why people can't stop talking about her. And again, the craziest part, it's one thing that she stole money, but a bigger thing, a lot of it seems she just did for attention. And again, it's not like she went out to the media. We know she knows how to speak to the media, right? But she never took this story to the media to try and get attention that way. No, she just wanted this therapist to talk to her, I guess. So it's a really crazy story. But some of these things she did try and do for financial gain. And in the next episode, we'll get into that. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Amanda. This is Don't Waste This Fucking Podcast, the story of Megan Stoner. I can't wait to talk to you next week.